You wake before the fire has fully caught. The floor is cold under your feet, and the air still smells of last night's smoke. A basin is set down in front of you, water steaming faintly in the dim light. You dip your hands in first, then your face, then you reach for the comb. This is not a rare morning. This is every morning, before weapons, before work, before anyone speaks a word about the day ahead. There is water, and there is a comb passing through tangled hair. Today, the word Viking conjures mud, blood, and matted beards. A warrior who never washed, never combed, never cared how he looked before he died. But for most of Viking Age Scandinavia, appearance wasn't an afterthought. It was a daily discipline, and a public one. By the end of this video, you'll understand why a comb was one of the most personal objects a Viking could own, why an entire day of the week was named after bathing, and why one English chronicler blamed Viking grooming habits for actual wars. The mud never washed off. That's the assumption most people carry into this story. A warrior who lived hard, fought hard, and smelled like it. The evidence says otherwise. Across Scandinavia during the Viking Age, wealthy farms and larger settlements built dedicated bathhouses. Some used natural hot springs, especially in Iceland. Others heated stones until they glowed, then threw water over them until the room filled with steam. It worked the same way a modern sauna does. Heat first, then a plunge into cold water, then soap, scrubbed in top to bottom. This wasn't occasional. It was structural. One day of the week existed for this alone. Compare that to the rest of medieval Europe at the time. Historians studying the period note that many ordinary Europeans bathed only a handful of times a year, relying on perfume rather than water to manage the smell. Archaeologists and chroniclers alike suggest the Norse stood out sharply against that backdrop. The clearest proof comes from an unlikely source, a 12th century English monk named John of Wallingford. Writing with open irritation, he complained that the Norse settlers in England combed their hair every day, bathed every Saturday, and changed their clothes often. He blamed this grooming, sincerely, for English women leaving their husbands for Norse men. He even suggested it caused real friction between Norse settlers and English farmers. An English chronicler didn't invent a compliment for the Vikings. He wrote a complaint. And the complaint was, they were too clean, too well-groomed, too hard to compete with. There's a darker footnote to this ritual too. Old sagas describe enemies timing their attacks for bath day, when warriors would be undressed, unarmed, and soaking in a wooden tub. Being caught clean was still being caught unprepared. That is not the image most people grow up with. The recipe was simple: wood ash, animal fat, water. Left to react, that combination produces lye, a strong alkaline compound. Mixed with fat, lye becomes soap. The Norse word for this process, lauf, is where the English word lye comes from. The connection isn't a coincidence. It's a linguistic fingerprint of a household technology that survived long enough to shape a modern language. Every longhouse had access to the ingredients: ash from the hearth, fat from butchered livestock. No trade route needed, no imported luxury, just someone who knew the ratio and knew how long to let it sit before it turned into something you could actually scrub with. The soap wasn't gentle. It was strong, almost caustic, effective at cutting through grease and dirt in a way delicate modern bars simply aren't built for. This was a working soap, made for hands that split wood and pulled nets, not a cosmetic afterthought. And it had a side effect Norse men and women seem to have used on purpose. Left in the hair or beard for a while, the lye's high alkalinity lightened it, gradually pulling it toward blonde. Historians studying the period believe this wasn't an accident people stumbled into and shrugged off. It was a look people were actively chasing, season after season. A warrior scrubbing grease from his hands with the very same soap that brightened his beard for the next feast. Cleanliness and vanity, solved together, by one bucket of ash and fat. Pick up any Viking Age grave with a decent inventory, and there's a good chance you'll find a comb resting near the body. Not a knife, not always a weapon, a comb. Researchers at the University of York have spent years studying exactly why. Working through thousands of comb fragments from sites across northern Europe, archaeologist Dr. Stephen Ashby found something unexpected. These were not thrown-together tools. They were carved from deer antler, using specialized saws and polishers, over-engineered, far beyond what basic grooming required, and often decorated with fine line work that took real skill to produce. You don't spend that much effort on something disposable. Ashby's conclusion is direct. Hair was central to Viking identity. The sagas back this up, describing hairstyles and beard care as markers of status, and sometimes of shame, when a man let his appearance slide. Combs were carried on belts, right alongside knives and blades, treated as everyday equipment rather than luxury items. The comb rarely traveled alone. Small grooming kits including tweezers, razors, and ear cleaners have turned up at sites across Scandinavia, suggesting a full routine, not a single tool used once in a while. Beards were trimmed with intention. Hair was cut, styled, sometimes bleached, and clearly compared against the hair of others in the same hall. And combs went into the ground with their owners, grave after grave. Across trading centers like Birka and York, combs turn up beside weapons, gaming pieces, jewelry. Objects a person was buried with tend to be objects that mattered to who they were in life. A warrior's kit, in other words, wasn't just an axe and a shield. It included a comb, carried with the same seriousness as a blade, because how you looked said something about who you were. And Vikings understood that message perfectly well. Language remembers things cultures forget to write down. In Old Norse, Saturday is laugardagur. Break the word apart, and you get laug, meaning bath or pool, and dagur, meaning day, bath day. It's not a poetic nickname historians invented later. It's the literal, functional name the week's sixth day carried across the Viking Age. Look at the modern descendants and the pattern holds. Swedish lørdag, Danish and Norwegian lørdag, Icelandic laugardagur. Every one of them still carries that same root, more than 1,000 years after the ritual it names. Most weekday names in Old Norse borrow from gods. Tyr, Odin, Thor, Frigg. Saturday breaks that pattern entirely. It wasn't handed to a god. It was handed to a chore, because that chore mattered enough to organize the calendar around. Old sagas mention it in passing, the way you'd mention any ordinary appointment. Someone is expected somewhere, but not until after the bath. A raid is planned, but not on a Saturday, when half the hall would be undressed and soaking in a tub. A society doesn't name a day after something it barely bothers to do. It names a day after a habit so fixed, so weekly, that everyone in the household already knew what it meant without being told twice. So why does the dirty barbarian still survive, centuries after the evidence stopped supporting him? Partly because violence photographs well, and grooming doesn't. Raids, longships, and axes make for a simpler story than a man carefully combing lightened hair before a feast. The parts of Viking life that made it into popular memory were the parts an outsider would be shocked enough to write down. A morning routine at home rarely shocks anyone, but the real picture is more interesting than the myth. These were people who bathed weekly in heated stone rooms, who made their own soap from ash and fat, who carried combs with the same care they carried a blade, and who named a whole day of the week after the ritual of getting clean. Appearance wasn't vanity layered on top of survival. For many Vikings, it was part of how survival, status, and identity worked together. If this changed how you picture a Viking morning, that's the whole point of this channel. Drop a comment. Which habit surprised you most? The soap, the comb, or the bath day itself? And if you're new here, hit subscribe. There's a lot more of daily Viking life waiting for you. This isn't the first time we've looked at a quiet corner of that daily life. If you haven't seen it yet, go back and watch our episode on the Viking Honor Code right after this one.